When was photography invented?
The concept of still photography dates back to the 10th century when Islamic scientists developed the camera obscura. Latin for dark chamber, a darkened enclosure with a small aperture, opening, to admit light. The light rays would cast an inverted image of external objects onto a flat surface opposite the aperture. This image could be studied and traced by someone working inside the camera obscura. Or the image could be viewed from the outside of the camera, through a peephole. In the 16th century, the Italian scientist Giambattista della Porta, c. 1535 to 1615, published his studies on fitting the aperture of the camera obscura with a lens to strengthen or enlarge the image projected. Made increasingly versatile through additional improvements. The camera obscura became popular among 17th and 18th century European artists. But the camera obscura could only project, rather than reproduce, images onto a screen or a piece of paper. During the 1800s, scientists experimented with ways of making the images permanent. Among those who made advances in the photographic process were French physicist Joseph Nicephore Niepce. 1765 to 1833, who produced the first negative image in 1826, French painter Louis-Jacques Daguerre. 1759 to 1851, who in 1839 succeeded in making a direct positive image on a silver plate. Known as the daguerreotype, English scientist William Henry Fox Talbot, 1800 to 1877, who developed a paper negative, c. 1841, that could be used to print any number of paper positives, and English astronomer Sir John Herschel. 1792 to 1891, who was the first to produce a practical photographic fixing agent and the first to apply the terms positive and negative to photographic images. All of these milestones made photography a practical way of permanently recording real-life images. The breakthrough in still photography was the Kodak. Introduced in 1888 by American inventor George Eastman, 1854 to 1932. The Kodak camera used film that was wound on rollers, eliminating the glass photographic plates that had been in use. The box-shaped camera made photography accessible to everyone, including amateurs. By the early 1900s, the Eastman Kodak Company had become the largest photographic film and camera producer in the world. George Eastman has been credited with mass-producing the moment, before the Kodak. A word he made up because he was fond of the letter K. Photography had largely been the domain of professionals who were commissioned to take portraits of the well-to-do prominent members of society. Once the Kodak became widely available, photographs preserved the faces of ordinary people and the events of everyday life.
When did higher education begin?
About the 6th century B. C. Schools of medicine existed on the island of Kos, Greece. where philosophers theorized on the nature of man and the universe. The Pythagoreans, followers of Greek philosopher and mathematician Pythagoras, c. 580 to 500 BC. Began the first schools of higher education in southern Italy, where philosophy and mathematics were taught in Greek. The great philosophers Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle carried on the Pythagorean tradition, as did Epicurus and Zeno in the 4th century BC. Universities have a long history in the Arab world, for example. The Al-Azhar University in Cairo was founded in about AD 970 and is one of the oldest universities in the world.
What was the Chautauqua movement?
It was a cultural, religious, and political education movement that began in the 1870s and lasted into the 1920s. An estimated 45 million Americans participated in the Chautauqua, making it a dominant force in American life during its day. Theodore Roosevelt, 1858 to 1919, hailed it as the most American thing in America, and, during World War I. 1914 to 18, Woodrow Wilson, 1856 to 1924, claimed that it was an integral part of the national defense. Some scholars credit the Chautauqua movement with sowing the seeds of liberal thought in America. The movement began in 1874 at a Methodist Episcopal campsite on the shores of Lake Chautauqua, New York. There a young minister named John H. Vincent, 1932 to 1920, of Camden, New Jersey, endeavored to train Sunday school teachers in a summer camp atmosphere. The program grew in popularity and was expanded beyond Bible study and religious training to include lessons in literacy, history, and sociology. Chautauqua-style summer camps, commonly called Sunday school assemblies, began popping up across the nation. All of them featured a general meeting hall or pavilion set in a campground. By 1900 there were 200 pavilions in 31 states. Attendees of all ages would attend the summer programs, which featured speakers on a wide variety of subjects, including the arts, travel, and politics. Performances also became part of the movement, with a variety of musicians and entertainers joining the lecturers. Early in the 20th century the Chautauqua became increasingly secular, and went on the road as an organized lecture and entertainment circuit. Speakers and performers traveled from town to town, where tents were set up for weeks at a time to house the summer programs. Many Americans saw their first movies in Chautauqua tents. The movement died out in the mid-1920s, with the improvement of communications and transportations. Some consider the Chautauqua the first form of American mass culture. The Chautauqua Institute in New York continues to host a summer education program in the spirit of the original.
Is it true that the engineers of the Challenger's O-rings warned NASA that the devices might fail?
Yes, but sadly the advice of the engineers went unheeded. The O-ring manufacturer, Morton Thiokol, gave the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, the go-ahead in the hours before Challenger's takeoff. On January 27, 1986, the night before the planned takeoff, the temperature at Cape Canaveral, Florida, dropped to well below freezing. Since no shuttle had been launched in temperatures below 53 degrees Fahrenheit, NASA undertook a late-night review to determine launch readiness. As a contractor, Morton Thiokol participated in this process, with their engineers expressing concerns about the O-rings on the shuttle's solid rocket boosters. They feared the rings would stiffen in the cold temperatures and lose their ability to act as a seal. Since the space agency was under pressure to launch the shuttle on schedule, NASA managers pushed the manufacturer for a go or no-go decision. The managers of Thiokol, who were aware that the O-rings had never been tested at such low temperatures, signed a waiver stating that the solid rocket boosters were safe for launch at the colder temperatures. Challenger was launched the next morning, at 11:38 a.m. About 1 minute into the flight, a flame became evident, and seconds later, the spacecraft exploded. All 7 crew members died. Investigators later concluded that the tragic accident had been caused by the failure of the O-rings.
Who was Rosie the Riveter?
The term referred to the American women who worked factory jobs as part of the war effort on the home front, where auto plants and other industrial facilities were converted into defense plants to manufacture airplanes, ships, and weapons. As World War II, 1939–45, wore on, more and more men went overseas to fight, resulting in a shortage of civilian male workers. And so, women pitched in. However, at the end of the war, many of these women were displaced as the men returned home to their jobs and civilian life. Nevertheless, the contribution of all the Rosie the Riveters was instrumental to the war effort.
What did Manifest Destiny have to do with the expansion of the United States?
The doctrine of manifest destiny emerged in the United States in the early 1800s and by the 1840s had taken firm hold. Adherents believed that Americans had a God-given right and duty to expand their territory and influence throughout North America. Manifest Destiny was a rallying cry for expansionism and prompted rapid U.S. acquisition of territory during the 1800s. The acquisitions began in 1803 with the purchase of Louisiana Territory from France. In 1819 Florida and the southern strip of Alabama and Mississippi, collectively called the Old Southwest, were acquired from Spain in the Adams-Nice Treaty. In 1845 Texas was annexed after white settlers fought for and declared freedom from Mexico. forming the Republic of Texas and petitioning the Union for statehood. In 1846 the western border between Canada and the United States was determined to lie at 49 degrees north latitude. The northern boundary of what is today Washington State, in 1848 by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The United States secured New Mexico and California after winning the Mexican War. 1846–48, and in 1853 southern Arizona was acquired from Mexico in the Gadsden Purchase. With the 1853 agreement, the United States had completed the acquisition of territory that makes up the contiguous states. The expansionist doctrine of manifest destiny was again invoked as justification for the Spanish-American War. 1898, which was fought over the issue of freeing Cuba from Spain. Spain lost the war, dissolving its empire. Cuba achieved independence, though it was occupied by U.S. troops for 3 years. By the close of the 19th century, manifest destiny had resulted in U.S. acquisition of the outlying territories of Alaska, Hawaiian Islands, Midway Islands, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Guam, Wake Island, American Samoa, Panama Canal Zone, and U.S. Virgin Islands.
When was the U.S. Constitution ratified?
The Constitution was ratified by the required 9 states by June 21, 1788. It went into effect the following year, superseding the Articles of Confederation, 1781.
What were the Camp David Accords?
Camp David Accords is the popular name for a 1979 peace treaty between Israel and Egypt. The name stuck since President Jimmy Carter, 1924, met with Israel's Menachem Begin. 1913 to 1992, and Egypt's Anwar Sadat, 1918 to 1981, at the presidential retreat at Camp David, Maryland. The treaty was actually signed on March 26, 1979, in Washington, D.C. with Carter as a witness to the agreement between the warring Middle Eastern nations. The pact, which was denounced by Arab countries, provided for the return of the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt. The mountainous area, adjacent to Israel and at the north end of the Red Sea, had been the site of a major campaign during the Arab-Israeli War of 1967 and had been occupied by Israel since. The transfer of the peninsula back to Egypt was completed in 1982. The Camp David Accords had also outlined that the two sides would negotiate Palestinian autonomy in the occupied West Bank and Gaza Strip. However, Sadat was assassinated in 1981. And this initiative saw no progress as a result of the Camp David Accords.
What are the 10 Commandments?
Also called the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments appear in the Bible in the book of Exodus 20:2-17, and in the book of Deuteronomy 5:6-21. They are considered the summary of divine law as handed down by God to Moses, who not only heard them but received them in the form of writing on 2 stone tablets as he stood atop Mount Sinai, what is known today as Gebel Musa. On Egypt's Sinai Peninsula, where he had been summoned by God. According to the Bible, the commandments, which are paramount in the ethical systems of Judaism and Christianity, are these: 1. Do not have any other God besides the Lord God. 2. Do not have or worship idols. Carved images. 3. Do not make wrong use of the name of the Lord your God, or do not take the name of the Lord in vain. 4. Keep the Sabbath day holy. 5. Honor your mother and your father. 6. Do not commit murder. 7. Do not commit adultery. 8. Do not steal. 9. Do not give false evidence against your neighbor. And 10. Do not covet your neighbor's household or lust after your neighbor's spouse.
Who founded the Dance Theater of Harlem?
The Dance Theater of Harlem, the first world-renowned African-American ballet company, was founded by Arthur Mitchell, 1934, a principal dancer with the New York City Ballet. Along with Carol Schuck, 1920-1985, a dance teacher and former director of the Netherlands Ballet. The impetus for the creation of the company came on April 4, 1968, while Mitchell was waiting to board a plane from New York City to Brazil, where he was establishing that country's first national ballet company. And he heard that Martin Luther King Jr., 1929-1968, had been assassinated.
When did football begin?
In ancient Greece and Rome, a game was played in which the object was to move a ball across a goal line by throwing, kicking, or running with it. Several modern games were derived from this, including rugby and soccer, from which American football directly evolved. In much of the world, football refers to soccer, in which players are allowed to advance the ball only with their feet or heads. Historians generally agree that the first game of American football was played on November 6, 1869, in New Brunswick, New Jersey, when Rutgers defeated the College of New Jersey, present-day Princeton University, 6-4. They played on a field 120 yards long and 75 yards wide and used a round, soccer-like ball. Other Eastern colleges, including Columbia, Harvard, and Yale, soon added the sport to their athletic programs. In 1876, a set of official rules were compiled. In the 1880s, Yale coach Walter Camp, 1859-1925, revised the rules, giving the world the game played today. He limited teams to 11 players, established the scrimmage system for putting the ball into play. Introduced the concept of requiring a team to advance the ball a certain number of yards within a given number of downs. And came up with the idea of marking the field with yard lines.
What was the gunpowder plot?
In 1605 a group of 12 men, who believed the English government to be hostile to Roman Catholics, laid plans to blow up the Houses of Parliament with King James I, 1566–1625, and government officials in it. Their scheme was discovered, however, and all of the conspirators were put to death. The event is remembered today in two ways: on the night of November 4, which was when the plot was supposed to be carried out, the English hold a festival in which Guy Fawkes (1570–1606), the conspirator who originated the gunpowder plot, is burned in effigy. Further, the vaults beneath the Houses of Parliament are searched before each new session.
When did the major combat phase of Operation Iraqi Freedom end?
President George W. Bush, 1946, declared an end to major combat on May 1, 2003. But the stabilization of Iraq was far from over. The fighting continued more than 2 years later, the result of an increasingly violent Iraqi insurgency. Faced with the ongoing resistance, in December 2004 the number of U.S. troops in the war-torn nation was increased from 130,000 to 150,000. Most of the casualties occurred after the declared end of major combat. On April 8, 2005, the Pentagon reported that there had been 1,543 American fatalities in the war to date, 1,174 in hostile actions and 369 in non-hostile actions, including accidents during routine maneuvers. Of the 1,543 U.S. military deaths, 1,404 died after the declared end of major combat, 1,065 of them from hostile action. More than 7,000 had been injured to date. In addition to the American fatalities, the British military had reported 86 deaths as of early April 2005, Italy 21, Ukraine 18, Poland 17, Spain 11, Bulgaria 8, Slovakia 3, Estonia, Thailand, and the Netherlands 2 each, and Denmark, El Salvador, Hungary, Kazakhstan, and Latvia 1 each. The figures fueled criticism for the lingering war, with some observers wondering if stabilization was possible in the fractious nation. There were several factors contributing to the growing lists of casualties and injuries. Coalition forces were frequently ambushed in attacks from resistance fighters and suicide bombers. U.S. troops faced continued combat in parts of Baghdad and its outskirts. The southern towns of Najaf and Kufa were holdouts of resistance, and there was intense fighting in the Sunni cities of Fallujah, Ramadi, and Samara, which remained under insurgent control even after the transfer of political authority from the United States to the interim Iraqi Authority on June 28, 2004.
What was the Peasants' War?
Fought in 1524 and 1525, the war was in part a religious one that came during the Reformation. It was the greatest mass uprising in German history. In 1517 the Ger man monk Martin Luther, 1483 to 1546, had begun questioning the authority of the Roman Catholic Church. He soon had followers, nobles and peasants alike, and his reform movement spread, giving birth to Protestantism. The Christian beliefs practiced by those who protested against the Catholic Church. While many Protestants were sincere in their faith, some had their own motives for following the movement. German peasants looked to the Reformation to end their oppression at the hands of the noble lords. When the peasants revolted at the end of 1524, they were forcibly suppressed. Some 100,000 peasants died prior to the uprising. They had aimed to get Martin Luther's endorsement, but he declined to give it.
How did the textile industry begin?
The large-scale factory production of textiles began in the late 1700s, becoming established first in Great Britain, where a cotton spinning machine was invented in 1783 by Richard Arkwright, 1732 to 1792. Spinning mills were introduced to the United States in 1790 by English-born machinist and businessman Samuel Slater, 1768 to 1835. The 21-year-old had worked as a textile laborer for more than 6 years in an English mill where he learned the workings of Arkwright's machine, which the British considered the cornerstone of their booming textiles industry. Laws prevented anyone with knowledge of the mill from leaving the country. In 1789 Slater, determined he could recreate the spinning mill and eager to seek his own fortune, disguised himself to evade the authorities and leave the country, sailing from England for American shores. Arriving in Providence, Rhode Island, he formed a partnership with the textiles firm Amey and Brown. Slater began building a spinning mill based on the Arkwright machine. This he did from memory. The spinning mill was debuted December 20, 1790, in the village of Pawtucket, Rhode Island, where the wheels of the mill were turned by the waters of the Blackstone River. The machine was a success and soon revolutionized the American textiles industry, which previously relied on cottage workers, the putting out system, to manufacture thread and yarn. Slater's innovation, which would earn him the title Father of the American textiles industry, spawned the factory system in the United States. By 1815 there were 165 cotton mills in New England, all working to capacity. The early mills were not large-scale, however, and for a time after Slater's introductions, New England mills and merchants continued to rely on home workers to weave threads, now produced by the mills, into cloth. In 1813 the Boston Manufacturing Company opened the first textile factory, where laborers ran spinning and weaving machines to produce woven cloth from start to finish. The advent of machinery had given rise to the factory system, and laborers were shifted from working in their homes to working in factories, while native New Englanders continued to provide the labor for the textile industry for the next 2 decades. An influx of immigrants in the mid-1800s provided the hungry manufacturers with a steady supply of laborers who were willing to work for less money and longer hours. Within the first 3 decades of the 1800s, New England became the center of the nation's textiles industry. The region's ample rivers and streams provided the necessary water power, and the commercial centers of Boston and New York City readily received the finished products. Labor proved to be in ample supply as well. Since the mill machinery was not complicated, children could operate it and did. Slater hired children ages 7 to 14 to run the mill, a practice that other New England textile factories also adopted. The Jefferson Embargo of 1807, which prohibited importing textiles, also aided the industry. New England's mills provided the model for the American factory system. Slater had brought the Industrial Revolution to America.
How were the Puritans different from the Pilgrims?
The Puritans who founded Massachusetts Bay Colony were, like the Pilgrims, religious Protestants. Both sects protested the Anglican Church. But while the Pilgrims separated from the Church, the Puritans wished to purify it. Their religious movement began in England during the 1500s. And they were influenced by the teachings of reformer John Calvin, 1509 to 1564. They also had strong feelings about government, maintaining that people can only be governed by contract, such as a constitution, which limits the power of a ruler. When King James I, 1566 to 1625, ascended the throne of England in 1603, he was the first ruler of the house, royal family, of Stuart. The Stuart monarchs, particularly James's successor, King Charles I, 1600 to 1649, tried to enforce absolute adherence to the High Church of Anglicanism, and viewed the Puritan agitators as a threat to the authority of the crown. Persecuted by the throne, groups of Puritans fled England for the New World. One group was granted a corporate charter for the Massachusetts Bay Company, 1629. Unlike other such contracts, which provided the framework for establishing colonies in America, this one did not require the stockholders to hold their meetings in England. Stockholders who made the voyage across the Atlantic would become voting citizens in their own settlement. The board of directors would form the legislative assembly, and the company president, Puritan leader John Winthrop, 1588 to 1649, would become the governor. In 1630 they settled in what is today Boston and Salem, Massachusetts, establishing a Puritan commonwealth. By 1643 more than 20,000 Puritans arrived in Massachusetts, in what is called the Great Migration. Puritans also settled in Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Virginia during the colonial period.
Was King Tut the greatest ruler of ancient Egypt?
No, in fact, King Tut's reign was relatively unimportant in the vast history of ancient Egypt. A ruler of the 18th dynasty, Tutankhamun, c. 1370 to 1352 BC, was in power from age 9, 1361 BC. Until his death at the age of 18, a 9-year period that would be of little significance were it not for the November 1922 discovery of his tomb in the Valley of the Kings near ancient Thebes, present-day Luxor. Of the 27 pharaohs buried near Thebes, only the tomb of the minor king, Tutankhamun, was spared looting through the ages. Having not been opened since ancient times, the tomb still contained its treasures. In the antechamber, English archaeologist Howard Carter, 1873 to 1939, found more than 600 artifacts, including funerary bouquets, sandals, robes, cups and jars, a painted casket, life-size wooden statues of Tutankhamun, animal-sided couches, remnants of chariots, and a golden throne. In the burial chambers, a team of archaeologists discovered 4 golden shrines and the golden coffin, containing the royal mummy of Tutankhamun, complete with a golden mask covering his head and shoulders. Earlier in his career, Carter had discovered the tombs of King Tut's predecessors, Queen Hatshepsut, c. 1520 c. 1468 BC, and King Thutmose IV, d. 1417 BC, both of whom were also rulers during Egypt's 18th dynasty.
What was the germ theory?
The germ theory, established in the mid-1800s, posited that certain germs cause diseases, refuting the ages-old notion of spontaneous generation. The idea was first put forth by French chemist and microbiologist Louis Pasteur, 1822 to 1895, in a paper he published in 1861. His research, and that of German physician Robert Koch, 1843 to 1910, eventually substantiated the germ theory as fact. They proved that the microbe, or germ, is a living organism that can cause disease. Koch was even able to isolate certain bacteria as the causes of particular diseases, including anthrax, for which he published a method of preventive inoculation, tuberculosis, cholera, and rinderpest, a cattle disease. The anthrax germ was the first germ linked to a particular disease by Koch in 1876. By the end of the 1800s researchers had discovered the kinds of bacteria and other microbes responsible for the plague. Diphtheria, dysentery, gonorrhea, leprosy, malaria, pneumonia, tetanus, and other infectious diseases.
What was the biggest gold rush?
The greatest American gold rush began on January 24, 1848, when James Marshall discovered gold at Sutter's Mill in Coloma, California. Within a year, a large-scale gold rush was on. As the nearest port, the small town of San Francisco grew into a bustling city as fortune seekers arrived from around the world. Due to the influx, by 1850 California had enough people to qualify it for statehood. This pattern repeated itself elsewhere in the American West, including the Pikes Peak Gold Rush in 1859, which effectively launched the city of Denver, Colorado. The gold rush led to the discovery of copper, lead, silver, and other useful minerals. It also spawned related industry. One of the success stories is that of Levi Strauss, 1829 to 1902. A Bavarian immigrant who in 1853 began making and selling sturdy clothing to miners in San Francisco. In other countries, gold rushes had the same effect on the growth and development of regions. After the precious metal was discovered in Australia in 1851, the country's population almost tripled over the course of the next decade. The effect of an 1861 gold rush in nearby New Zealand was to double the country's population in 6 years' time. An 1886 discovery in South Africa led to the development of the city of Johannesburg. Just over a decade later, the infamous Yukon Gold Rush in the Klondike region of Canada spurred development there.
Why is mythology so widely studied?
The mythologies of various peoples are studied for their religious meanings, for their similarities to each other, and as a way of understanding the culture that originated them. Through the centuries, scholars have arrived at various conclusions about mythology. Scottish anthropologist Sir James Frazer, 1854 to 1941, studied folklore and religion and found parallel beliefs between the systems of primitive cultures and Christianity. He published his theories in the highly influential work titled The Golden Bough, 1890. Proposing that all myths center on the cycles of nature and birth, death, and resurrection. Polish-born English anthropologist Bronislaw Malinowski, 1884 to 1942, asserted that myths are nothing more than the validation of accepted social behavior and patterns within a culture. Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung, 1875 to 1961, posited that all cultures have unconsciously formed the same mythic symbols or motifs, called archetypes. To many theologians, mythologies are viewed simply as corruptions of the Bible. whatever their meaning or however they are interpreted. Myths have figured prominently in literature from the 5th century BC works of Greek tragedy on Aeschylus to the 20th century works of poets T.S. Eliot and Wallace Stevens.
What was the Enlightenment?
The Enlightenment, which is also referred to as the Age of Reason, or alternately as the Age of Rationalism, was a period when European philosophers emphasized the use of reason as the best method for learning the truth. Beginning in the 1600s and lasting through the 1700s, philosophers such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau (1712–1778), Voltaire (1694–1778), and John Locke (1632–1704), explored issues in education, law, and politics. They published their thoughts, issuing attacks on social injustice, religious superstition, and ignorance. Their ideas fanned the fires of the American and French revolutions in the late 1700s. Hallmarks of the Age of Reason include the idea of the universal truth, 2 + 2 always equals 4. For example, the belief that nature is vast and complex but well ordered. The belief that humankind possesses the ability to understand the universe, the philosophy of deism, which holds that God created the world and then left it alone, and the concept of the rational will, which posits that humans make their own choices and plans, and therefore, do not have a fate thrust upon them. While the Age of Reason proved to be a flurry of intellectual activity that resulted in the publication of several encyclopedias of knowledge, toward the end of the 18th century a shift occurred. During this time Europeans began to value passion over reason, giving rise to the Romantic movement and ending the Age of Reason. This change in outlook is evident in English novelist Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility. Nevertheless, the philosophies put forth during the Age of Reason were critical to the development of Western thought. The celebration of individual reason during this era was perhaps best expressed by René Descartes (1596–1650), who refused to believe anything unless it could be proved. His statement, "I think, therefore I am," sums up the feelings of skeptical and rational inquiry that characterized intellectual thought during the era.
What was the Supreme Court's role in racial segregation?
Though most segregation laws, or Jim Crow laws, were overturned by decisions of the Supreme Court during the 1950s and 1960s, the court was righting its own wrong, in the late 1800s. During the years following the Civil War, 1861–65, and the abolition of slavery, the Supreme Court made rulings that actually supported segregation laws at the state level. The most famous of these was the 1896 case of Plessy v. Ferguson, in which the highest court in the land upheld the constitutionality of Louisiana's law requiring separate but equal facilities for whites and blacks in railroad cars. One strong dissenting opinion came from Associate Justice John Marshall Harlan, who declared the Constitution is color blind. Following the Plessy v. Ferguson decision, states went on to use the separate but equal principle for 50 years, passing Jim Crow laws that set up racial segregation in public schools, transportation, and in recreation, sleeping, and eating facilities. This meant there were drinking fountains, benches, restrooms, bus seats, hospital beds, and theater sections designated as whites only or colored. One Arkansas law even provided that witnesses being sworn in to testify in a courtroom be given different Bibles depending on the color of their skin. Two landmark Supreme Court decisions came in 1954 and 1960 in the cases of Brown v. the Board of Education and Boynton v. Virginia. In the first case, parents of black children in Topeka, Kansas, elementary schools charged that the segregation of white and black students in the public schools denied black children the equal protection cited in the 14th Amendment, 1868. The parents were supported in their fight by the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, whose legal counsel included Thurgood Marshall, 1908 to 1993. On May 17, 1954, the Supreme Court ruled that segregated schools do violate the Equal Protection Clause, overturning the separate but equal doctrine previously upheld by Plessy v. Ferguson. The federal government again made a stand against state segregation laws when, in December 1960, Chief Appellant Lawyer Thurgood Marshall argued the case of Howard University law student Bruce Boynton before the Supreme Court, again ruling in favor of the plaintiff, who had charged that the segregation laws at the Richmond, Virginia, bus station violated the federal anti-segregation laws. Washington sent a clear message to the states that public facilities are for the use of all citizens, regardless of color. These decisions combined with the activism of the civil rights movement to outlaw racial segregation.
Is there an American poet laureate?
Yes, in 1985 the U.S. Congress authorized the naming of a national poet laureate. In 1986 Kentucky-born man of letters Robert Penn Warren, 1909 to 1989, became the country's first poet laureate. Among his works are the novels All the King's Men, 1946, Pulitzer Prize, and A Place to Come To, 1977, several volumes of poetry, and essays published in the anthology I'll Take My Stand, 1930. He was also the editor, 1935-42, of the literary journal The Southern Review. Warren's successors have included Joseph Brodsky, Mona Van Dyne, the first woman to receive the honor, and Rita Dove, the first African American to receive the honor. The complete list of poet laureates is available on the Library of Congress's website. http://www.loc.gov/poetry/laureate.html
What was National Road?
National Road was the first federal road. Today, the path of the Great Westward Route is followed closely by U.S. Highway 40. Congress authorized construction of the road in 1806 to answer the cry of settlers, who demanded a better route across the Appalachians into the Ohio River Valley. Originally called Cumberland Road, work began in 1811 in Cumberland, Maryland. Progress was slow, the road did not reach present-day Wheeling, West Virginia, a distance of 130 miles, until 6 years later. But in 1830 President Andrew Jackson, 1767 to 1845, gave the project a boost when he signed an act of Congress appropriating $130,000 to survey and extend the Cumberland Road westward. Jackson called it a national road. It was also called the Great National Pike. By the time the route was completed in 1852, it extended westward from Wheeling to cross Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, where it ended at Vandalia, east of St. Louis. The project cost the government more than $7 million to complete, but accomplished what had been hoped. National roads spurred development in the Old Northwest, the present-day states of Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and part of Minnesota, and the far west, the territories west of the Mississippi River. The overland route was traversed in covered wagons and conestogas by pioneers and tradesmen. Large quantities of goods, including livestock, grain, and finished products, were transported both east and west. Towns along the route boomed. By the end of the century, the road diminished in importance as settlers, new immigrants, and goods were transported along the railroads that had begun to crisscross the nation in 1865. Nevertheless, the National Road heralded the future of federal transportation projects that would knit the nation together.
Who is the enemy of the day?
Terrorists. News stories reinforce that this catch-all term does not only include the 9/11 hijackers and their Al-Qaeda associates, the Madrid and London train bombers, and suicide bombers in Gaza, but anti-government extremists who blew up a federal building in Oklahoma City, a still unknown distributor of deadly anthrax, and animal rights activists who routinely damage property to make a point. Terrorism is a decades, some might argue, centuries, old problem. Remember Birmingham, Alabama 16th Street Baptist Church, bombed in 1963 by white supremacists during Sunday services. Remember the 1972 Summer Olympics in Munich. when the Arab terrorist group Black September killed 11 Israeli athletes held captive in the Olympic Village. Remember the October 1985 hijacking of the Achille Lauro cruise ship by members of the Palestinian Liberation Front, who killed a wheelchair-bound American Jew. Remember the December 1988 bombing of Pan Am Flight 103, which came down in Lockerbie, Scotland, claiming 270 lives. The list is long and growing. The shocking events of September 11, 2001, centered the world's attention on the problem of well-financed terrorist networks that can turn the freedoms of democracy against civilians and who are feared to have in their possession or access to powerful weapons of mass destruction, WMD. The events of that day launched what the US government calls the global war on terrorism. A long battle that even the president acknowledged may not be winnable in a traditional sense. This is a new kind of war, fought not against a nation, but against anarchists halfway around the world. And in our midst, globalization and terrorism are the twin concerns of the modern era.
When was the bicycle invented?
A series of inventions during the 1800s resulted, in 1876, in the introduction of the safety bicycle. The direct ancestor of the modern bike and the first commercially successful bicycle. It had wheels that were equal in size, making it easier and safer to ride than its high-wheeler predecessor. The bikes proliferated. By 1900 more than 10 million Americans owned bicycles. As with other inventions, the bicycle was the result of the work of several innovators. In 1817 German Baron Karl Friedrich Freiherr von Drais de Sauerbrunn. 1785 to 1851, developed a device that resembled a scooter. Named for its inventor, the Drazier and later improved by Scotsman Kirkpatrick Macmillan. 1813 to 1878, who in 1839 added pedals to the vehicle, giving the world the first real bicycle. In 1870 English inventor James Starley, 1830 to 1881. Designed a bicycle with a large front wheel and small rear wheel. Named the Ariel, the invention was also called a penny farthing. After two very different sized British coins, the high wheeler, and the ordinary. Though the bicycle was easier to pedal and faster, one revolution of the pedals turned the front wheel once. Its high center of gravity made it unstable and even dangerous. The innovation of the tricycle, or velocipede, improved the design of the Ariel by giving it the added stability of the third wheel. But it was not until the safety bike was developed in 1876 that the bicycle's popularity took off.
How did Eli Whitney invent the cotton gin?
American inventor Eli Whitney, 1765 to 1825, is credited with developing the cotton gin, a machine that removes cotton seeds from cotton fibers. A simple cotton gin, called the churka, dates back to ancient India. 300 BC. But Whitney's gin would prove to be far superior. In 1792 Whitney, who had recently graduated from Yale University, was visiting the Georgia plantation owned by Catherine Littlefield Greene, widow of American Revolution, 1775–83, hero General Nathaniel Greene, 1742–1786. Whitney observed that short staple, or upland, cotton, which has green seeds that are difficult to separate from the fiber, differs from long staple, also called sea island, cotton, which has black seeds that are easily separated. The latter was the staple of American commerce at the time. In 1793 Whitney, who is described as a mechanical genius, completed an invention that could be used to clean bowls of short staple cotton of their seeds. He patented it the next year. The machine worked by turning a crank, which caused a cylinder covered with wire teeth to revolve. The teeth pulled the cotton fiber, carrying it through slots in the cylinder as it revolved. Since the slots were too small for the seeds, they were left behind. A roller with brushes then removed the fibers from the wire teeth. The cotton gin revolutionized the American textiles industry, which was then but a fledgling concern. The increase in cotton production was as much as 50-fold. One large gin could process 50 times the cotton that a slave laborer could in a day. Soon plantations and farms were supplying huge amounts of cotton to textile mills in the Northeast, where in 1790 another inventor, British-born industrialist Samuel Slater, 1768–1835, had built the first successful water-powered machines for spinning cotton. Together the inventions founded the American cotton industry. Whitney struggled to protect his patent, but imitations of his invention were already in production, prompting the U.S. government to allow his patent to expire. Though he did not profit from his cotton gin, he went on to devise a system of interchangeable parts, which introduced the idea of mass production and revolutionized manufacturing.
What were the Boer Wars?
They were conflicts between the British and the Afrikaners, or Boers, who were Dutch descendants living in South Africa. At the end of the 19th century in what is today South Africa. The First War, a Boer rebellion, broke out in 1880 when the British and the Afrikaners fought over the Kimberley area, Griqualand West, where a diamond field had been discovered. The fighting lasted a year, at which time the South African Republic, established in 1856, was restored. But the stability would not last long. In 1886 gold was discovered in the Transvaal. And though the Afrikaner region was too strong for the British to attempt to annex it, they blocked the Afrikaners' access to the sea. In 1899 the Afrikaner republics of the Orange Free State and the Transvaal joined forces in a war against Britain. The fighting raged until 1902, when the Afrikaners surrendered. For a time after the Boer War, also called the South African War, the Transvaal became a British Crown colony. In 1910 the British government combined its holdings in southern Africa into the Union of South Africa.
What is a Trojan horse?
B. C. A Trojan horse has come to symbolize anything that looks good but is actually subversive. According to his Trojan War epic the Iliad. After nearly 10 years of fighting the Trojans for control of their city, the Greek Mycenaean army built a huge wooden horse on wheels and offered it as a gift to their enemy. Leaving the peace offering outside the city walls of Troy, the Mycenaean army then departed. Despite warnings, including one from the Trojan princess Cassandra, the Trojans accepted the gift. And they opened the gates and wheeled the huge wooden horse into the city. It was a naive move, once the horse was inside the city gates. Mycenaean soldiers who were hidden inside the wooden structure took Troy by storm, ending the decade-long campaign and taking control of the lucrative Black Sea trade.
How is Picasso's work characterized?
It's impossible to characterize or classify the work of Spaniard Pablo Picasso, 1881–1973. Since his career as an artist spanned his entire life and he experimented with many disciplines. Picasso often claimed that he could draw before he could speak. And by all accounts he spent much of his childhood engaged in drawing. He was only 15 years old when he submitted his first works for exhibition. And by the turn of the century, when he was still a young man, he began exploring the blossoming modern art movement. The rest of his career breaks into several periods. His blue period, 1901–04, was named for the monochromatic use of the color for its subjects, and was likely the result of a despair brought on by the suicide of a friend. Next came his rose period, beginning 1905. When images of harlequins and jesters appear in his works, all to a somewhat melancholic effect. He soon began to incorporate aspects of primitive art, and later experimented with geometric line and form in his works, which were constructions or deconstruct ions sometimes only identifiable by their title. In the spring of 1912 Cubism exploded, and Picasso was on its forefront. In 1923 he broke new ground with Surrealism. The key masterpiece in his body of works came in 1937 when he painted Guernica. His rendering of the horror of the German attack, supported by Spanish fascists, on the small Basque town of Guernica, in Spain. His career reached its height during the 1940s, during which he lived in Nazi-occupied Paris. Biographer Pierre Cabane summed up the last period, 1944–73, of Picasso's work. He invented a second classicism. Autobiographical classicism. His final 30 years were to be a dizzying, breakneck race toward creation. During this time, Picasso did not chart any new artistic territory, but simply created art at an amazing rate. After his death in 1973, his estate yielded an inventory of 35,000 remaining works paintings, drawings, sculptures, ceramics, prints, and woodcuts. He left an enormous, even mind-boggling legacy to the art world. In a 1991 article in Vanity Fair, Picasso's friend and biographer John Richardson observed, "Almost every artist of any interest who's worked in the last 50 years is indebted to Picasso, whether he's reacting against him knowingly or is unwittingly influenced by him. Picasso sowed the seeds whose fruits we are continuing to reap.